For Hegel, the principal task of reason, in his preferred sense of Vernunft rather than Verstand, is, as he says, to give contingency the form of necessity. Following Kant, by necessary he means having the form of a rule. That is, for him, reason's job is to put the sort of material contingencies the genealogist points to into a normative shape. From Hegel's point of view, far from undercutting reason, the possibility of genealogical explanations just underlines the need for this particular function of reason and the crucial job that it does. So, how can we understand the process whereby concepts acquire and develop their determinate content as putting contingencies of their application into a normative shape? Hegel's idea is that a distinctive kind of retrospective rational reconstruction of prior applications of a concept is necessary and sufficient to exhibit those applications as conferring a determinate content on the concept. One brings order to the motley welter that is the discursive practice one inherits by discriminating within it a privileged trajectory that's expressively progressive, in the sense of making gradually explicit norms that then show up retrospectively as having been all along implicit. Doing that, he says, is turning a past into a history. The best model I know of the kind of rational activity that determines conceptual contents by making or finding the right kind of history for them is the jurisprudential one, institutionalized and codified in case law. Its purest paradigmatic form takes place in what in the Anglo-American legal world is called common law. For in that realm, by contrast to statute law, judges are not guided in their decisions as to whether to apply or withhold the application of a concept, say the concept of strict liability, by explicit statutes propounded and given the force of law by legislatures, statutes that say explicitly what is and is not licit according to the norm they institute. In case law, in lieu of norms explicit as such principles, judges at common law must decide cases with novel facts on the basis only of norms that they discern as implicit in the tradition of already decided cases. The governing authority to which common law judges are responsible is provided by precedent. The judge's job is not only to decide the present case, but also to provide a rationale for the decision by providing a distinctive kind of narrative justifying it as correct. Such a narrative selects some prior decisions as precedential, in the sense of being not only relevant and correct, but as having revealed some hitherto hidden aspect or contour of the norm that's developing in the tradition defined by those precedents. The legal concepts and principles explicating them that are given expression as rationales for deciding novel cases are often characterized as judge-made law. And this description is apt because there's nothing more to give content to this kind of law and its concepts than the decisions that judges have rendered and the retrospective rational reconstructions of traditions defined by precedents that the judges offer to justify those decisions. Rationalizing processes of this sort are both responsible to the contents of the conceptual norms they apply, and they exercise authority over the development of those conceptual contents. They are processes of determining conceptual contents, both in the sense of finding out what those contents are, manifested in the essentially retrospective rationales judges supply for their decisions, and in the sense of making those contents what they are, manifested in the essentially prospective shifting and sharpening of the norms that each new application and interpretation provides. These hermeneutic practices give contingency the normative form of necessity, and by incorporating those contingencies, infuse determinate content into the developing norms. It's of the essence of the kind of rationality distinctive of this sort of concept-determining process to be articulated by these complementary perspectives: retrospective, determining as finding, and prospective, determining as making. Responsibility to the tradition one inherits and authority over the tradition one bequeaths. Looking backward along the privileged trajectory of precedents selected by the narrative rationalizing any particular decision, one sees only unbroken expressive progress. the gradual emergence into the explicit light of day of a governing norm that appears as having been all along implicit in earlier decisions. But looking forward at how legal concepts and principles evolve by being applied in concrete cases, the discontinuities between those narratives show up as sequential judges revise their predecessors' judgments as to which earlier applications should be treated as precedential and how. T.S. Eliot describes this aspect of Hegelian Vernunft as at work in a different corner of the culture. He says, what happens when a new work of art is created is something that happens simultaneously to all the works of art that preceded it. The existing monuments form an ideal order among themselves, which is modified by the introduction of the new, the really new, work of art among them. The existing order is complete before the new work arrives. For order to persist after the supervention of novelty, the whole existing order must be, if ever so slightly, altered, and so the relations, proportions, and values of each work of art toward the whole are adjusted, and this is conformity between the old and the new. Now, considering genealogical counterfactuals about what the norms would have been had various non-evidential factors differed reveals a judicial process shot through with contingencies. As for instance, when the order in which two cases happen to be adjudicated evidently affects the content of the law that results. The normatively contingent character of any particular decision to apply or not to apply a particular concept is manifested in the fact that one always can explain any particular decision genealogically, in terms of what the judge had for breakfast, in the derisive slogan of jurisprudential theory. That is to explain it in terms that do not appeal to the content of the norm whose applicability is in question. To explain it instead, for instance, in terms of the intellectual fashions or public passions of the day, or by features of the judge's training, temperament, or political convictions. But to conclude that the possibility of such an explanation means that no norm is therefore instituted, that the norms discerned as implicit in the tradition inherited cannot rationally justify one decision rather than another in a novel case, is to insist stubbornly and one-sidedly on occupying only one of the perspectives that are in fact two sides of one coin, as Hegel insists and as jurisprudential practice demonstrates. It's precisely to refuse to see Vernunft whole. It's to embrace the semantic naivete that ignores the essential role rationally incorporating those contingencies plays in conferring determinate content on, determining the content of, always evolving conceptual norms. Hegel points to the generality of the lesson he wants us to learn from his Vernunft model of the practice of reason in a remarkable passage epitomized in an aphorism expressing his twist on a slogan of the day. He says, "No man is a hero to his valet." But that's not because the man is not a hero, but because the valet is a valet. The passage continues, explaining that the reason is that the valet's dealings are with the man, not as a hero, but as one who eats, drinks, and wears clothes in general, with his individual wants and fancies. Thus, for the judging consciousness, there is no action in which it could not oppose to the universal aspect of the action the personal aspect of the individuality, and so play the part of the moral valet toward the agent. What Hegel calls the universal aspect of the action is its normative dimension. The hero is a hero insofar as he acts according to the norms that articulate his duty. The valet views what the hero does genealogically, in resolutely naturalistic, non-normative, reductive terms. And so, as the passage continues, the valet explains the action as resulting from selfish motives. Just as every action is capable of being looked at from the point of view of conformity to duty, so too can it be considered from the point of view of the particularity of the doer. If the action is accompanied by fame, then it knows this inner aspect to be a desire for fame. The inner aspect is judged to be an urge to secure his own happiness, even though this were to consist merely in an inner moral conceit, in the enjoyment of being conscious of his own superiority, and in the foretaste of a hope of future happiness. No action can escape such judgment. For duty's sake, this pure purpose is an unreality. It becomes a reality in the deed of an individuality, and the action is thereby charged with the aspect of particularity. That's the end of the quote. Here, Hegel, writing in 1806, before the advent of the great unmaskers of the dawning 19th century, acknowledges that every application of a norm is in principle liable to a naturalistic genealogical explanation. It can be seen, indeed can be correctly seen, as far as that vision reaches, from the point of view of its particularity, its normative contingency. But that valet's-eye genealogical view is one-sided. It fails to see the whole of the doing. For the valet fails to see that a norm can also be active, that the particular contingent motives he sees, what the hero had for breakfast, can be given the form of normative necessity, can be incorporated in a narrative that exhibits them as in conformity to duty, as correctly performed according to the governing norms. Hegel calls the genealogical valet's attitude Niederträchtigkeit, literally something like a striving for the low, an impulse to debase. His term for the practical attitude of giving contingency the normative form of necessity is Edelmütigkeit, magnanimity. It's a form of norm-instituting recognition. Its retrospective recognitive aspect he calls forgiveness. Its prospective recognitive aspect he calls confession. What one forgives is the normative contingencies that infect prior applications of concepts. One forgives them not wholesale by a grand gesture, but by the hard retail work of constructing an expressively progressive historical narrative, in which they play precedential roles as making explicit aspects of the developing conceptual content that are now revealed as hitherto having been all along implicit. The slogan of this generous hermeneutic recognitive attitude is Tennyson's, when he says, "Yet I doubt not through the ages one increasing purpose runs, and the thoughts of men are widened with the process of the suns." This is what Hegel does in his own writings, first and foremost in the phenomenology, but no less in the histories he constructs for philosophy, art, and religion in his lectures. Concrete, magnanimous hermeneutic forgiveness is finding such a purpose, that is, a norm, to which the concept application being forgiven can be seen to contribute, so widening the thoughts of man. Hegel calls this making what happens into something done. What the magnanimous interpreter confesses is the contingent inadequacy of each particular such forgiving rational reconstruction. One confesses that one is unable to find a narrative in which every contingency is given the normative status of a progressive precedential expression of the underlying developing conceptual norm. In confessing, one petitions one's successors for forgiveness of that contingent failure of one's own effort at forgiveness. The edelmütig, rationalizing process in which conceptual norms are instituted by diachronic magnanimous reciprocal recognition is a structure of trust. Trust that one's trespasses will be forgiven as one forgives those who have trespassed before one. So Hegel foresaw the genealogical challenge to rational normativity that would arise from a reductive naturalism and would result in a small-minded, niederträchtig valet's hermeneutics of suspicion. The hermeneutics of magnanimity and trust he recommends instead is not based on fine feeling or pious sentiment. Instead, he argues that the only construal in which reason and meaning are threatened by the possibility of genealogy is a narrow, one-sided conception that's mistaken because semantically naive. In its place, he puts a more capacious conception of Vernunft as comprising not only the norm-governed application of concepts, but the process and practice by which their content is determined. At its core is the magnanimous hermeneutics that shapes genealogical contingency into a normative rational form.